Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to watch this pre-recorded webinar on the Career Technical Initiative. We will cover 8 key topics during today's conversation. We will start with an overview of the goal of the CTI program, discuss CTI program requirements, grant offerings, and timelines for grant releases over the next 6 months. Then we will specifically discuss planning grants, as the FY22 planning grant was released November 15th. We will talk about how to choose between implementation and planning, expectations of the planning period, requirements for an RFR submission, and we will finish by outlining additional times that you can hear from the CTI team live this fall. If you are a school that has been a CTI grantee in a planning phase or previous funding round, please note that we will provide a summary of how program requirements have changed in a virtual live convening on November 18th. This webinar is intended for schools who have not yet received CTI grant funds and provides a holistic introduction to the program. We will start off with a quick overview of CTI and program requirements. In January 2020, Governor Baker announced a new initiative to transform vocational high schools into career technical institutes, running 3 shifts per day to expand enrollment of high school students and adults. The purpose of ComCore's Career Technical Initiative is to support this vision through the expansion of after-dark training capacity for adults at high schools with designated aligned C74 vocational programs. Specifically, the grant funds opportunities for unemployed and underemployed adults, defined as workers at 60% or less of median income. The grant outlines 20 in-demand, in-scope occupations, which we will cover shortly. As mentioned, third shift training occurs outside of daytime instructional hours, generally 5 to 9 p.m. and/or weekends. Lastly, schools must have a Chapter 74 approved vocational program aligned to the occupation pathway they apply for. We are going to cover 4 main sets of program requirements today. First is guidance around occupations. Second is around eligibility and target population. Third, we will discuss applicants and required partners. And lastly, we will touch on funding and reporting. First, when setting up their CTI program, C74 approved schools are required to focus on pathways that train for the 20 listed here as in-demand occupations. These occupations span construction and skilled trades and manufacturing. These occupations have been identified as priority occupations by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. When considering which occupations to train for, schools should consider 5 key pathway-related requirements. First, as mentioned, you must have a designated C74 vocational program aligned to that occupation. Second, implementing CTI requires a minimum of 2 occupations to be trained for. Schools must apply for at least 1 cohort and not more than 6 cohorts per occupational program they run, with a minimum of 10 students per cohort. Fourth, curriculum must allow for between 200 and 300 hours of instruction. And lastly, the training must result in an industry-recognized credential for that occupation. In addition to occupational goals, the CTI grant requires participants to be unemployed or underemployed. An unemployed individual is defined as an individual who is earning less than 60% of the median income within their county of residence. A chart similar to the one identified here will be outlined in the implementation RFR to help schools further understand participant eligibility. As you know, the lead applicant for the CTI grant are Massachusetts high schools with aligned C74 programs. The lead applicant must also identify required partners. First, schools must partner with MassHire Workforce Boards. MassHire Workforce Boards are regional entities that provide planning and convening to address workforce development issues and create connections between employers, job seekers, training providers, and other workforce entities. In addition, schools partner with MassHire Career Centers. Mass Ag Career Centers are centers that deploy unemployment insurance benefits and provide a variety of services for job seekers, like resume reviewing, interview coaching, and training referrals. Lastly, schools must partner with at least 2 committed employer partners. Lead applicants are expected to participate in the following: contracting with Concor, partnering with their Mass Hire Career Centers, communicating with partners on timelines and entry requirements, recruiting, assessing, and screening participants, and ultimately making enrollment decisions, coordinating and providing all training, creating a plan to provide instruction in a social distancing environment if needed, incorporating work readiness and job search prep into training, collecting and reporting participant data, preparing and placing graduates in employment, and submitting invoices. To achieve these requirements, schools are expected to work closely with Mass Hire partners. The Mass Hire Career Center and Workforce Board will partner with the lead applicant in recruiting, assessing, and screening participants, contacting participants throughout training to encourage persistence, referring participants to support services such as childcare and transportation, helping prepare and place graduates in employment, and providing post-job placement support. Note that Mass Hire partners are not solely responsible for these activities, and as the lead applicants, schools are expected to maintain responsibilities for these actions. Several of the responsibilities overlap between the lead applicant and partner, such as recruitment and graduate placement. Schools are expected to include their Mass Hire partners in planning for training and defining activities and responsibilities for the partnership. There are 2 staff roles being rolled out across the Commonwealth to support CTI schools. The first are located at Mass Hire Career Centers called Upskilling Navigators. These individuals will support the recruitment, screening, and enrollment of job seekers. A second are market maker staff, who will work to enhance employer engagement. Before we move on to grant offerings and timelines, there are 3 key items around funding and reporting. First, all funds will be managed on cohort cost reimbursement and performance basis. Schools are expected to submit invoices and receive funds in net 30 days from Concor. All program-related costs are allowable. This will be outlined in more detail in the implementation RFR released on November 30th. And schools are required to report progress, including enrollment, completion, and placement at 30 days retention. Now that we have overviewed the purpose of CTI and the expectation and requirements for implementing the program, I'm going to outline the grant offerings that support schools getting to this stage and the FY22 timelines for funding release. First, I want to outline how the funding that the Workforce Skills Cabinet is making available supports schools in getting to the implementation stage previously outlined. In addition to per-student funds available for implementation, schools have the opportunity to first receive a planning grant and to additionally receive startup funds in their first implementation round. To start, planning grants provide 2 to 3 months for schools to plan a CTI program. We will describe the application process in more detail later, as this grant was released on November 15th, but as a high-level overview, these funds are used to design and plan for submitting a proposal for implementation. Schools most often use these funds to cover staff or contracted time to confirm partners, confirm pathways and occupations in demand, determine their instructional capacity and recruit adjunct staff as necessary, design curriculum, and outline their recruitment plan and budget. The grant makes available up to $10,000 on a cost reimbursement basis and is generally a 2 to 3 month period. All schools who have not yet received CTI funds are eligible to first apply for a planning period. Next, the Commonwealth provides up to $40,000 in startup funds. These funds are meant to support schools in their first cohorts, and it is not a separate application. Rather, they are applied for by schools submitting their first implementation round. Allowable costs will be further outlined in the grant RFR released in late November, but example costs include staffing, supplies, and marketing. Startup funds are available to schools in their first implementation application and eligible for that 24-month period. Lastly, schools reach the implementation phase. This grant makes available up to $6,000 per student on a cost reimbursement basis. The grant covers all program costs, but common uses are instructor staffing, staffing and materials for student supports and placements, recruiting and marketing costs, cost of materials and supplies, and administrative costs. These grants have a duration of 2 years. When schools apply for implementation grants, they are expected to outline their planning cohorts and training over this 2-year period. This application is separate from the planning grant application, and applying for this funding is the goal of any planning period. Now that we have outlined what funding is available, first-time CTI schools may be wondering how to decide whether to apply for an implementation grant or first apply for a planning grant. We've outlined 10 guiding questions in checklist format to help schools make this decision. The more boxes you are able to check, the more ready you are to move straight to an implementation grant without first applying for a planning period. Key considerations are whether you are currently providing post-secondary or adult training, whether you have experience providing workforce industry credential training programs, what your staff availability is or ability to hire adjunct and industry staff. To that end, whether you have experience hiring evening staff that are not your full-time faculty, whether you have experience working with key partners, especially MassHire Career Centers, whether you have experience working with unemployed or underemployed job seekers, and adults with language or learning barriers, whether you have 20 hours of a half-time employee to act as a point of contact, whether you have experience in receiving state or federal funds, and whether you have the fiscal capacity to submit invoices for payment in a cost reimbursement model. Schools who are able to check off at least the top 5 of these questions are likely ready for an implementation grant. For others, you may first consider a planning period. You can contact our CTI program manager, Jess, if you would like to discuss grant offerings and are deciding what entry point to apply for. To support schools both wanting to plan and wanting to apply directly for implementation or add cohorts to their current implementation contracts, we have 3 anticipated grant releases for the remaining 6 months of the Commonwealth fiscal year, 2 of which are being released this month. First, a planning grant was released on November 15th and is due on December 15th. We anticipate the planning period to start in early February. We will dig into this application in the next section. In addition to the planning grant, there will be 2 opportunities to apply for implementation grants in FY22. The first is being released November 30th and will be due by January 14th. We expect that schools will be able to start training as early as the spring through this opportunity. In addition, we anticipate putting out an implementation grant in the spring, likely being due at the end of April. This will provide those who enter a planning period the opportunity to apply for implementation funds and any additional schools interested in applying for new occupations or cohorts at that time. Schools could start training as early as this summer, but this opportunity also allows for fall 2022 training starts. As I mentioned, we will now shift towards talking about the requirements for responding to the planning grant that was released on November 15th. High level, the purpose of the planning grant is to build relationships, plan, and program design ahead of a submission for an implementation grant in April 2022. Suggested planning grant activities include, but are not limited to, connecting with MassHire partners, both your workforce board and career centers, to assess potential occupations and pathways to focus on based on C74 program capabilities, labor market demand for potential occupations, current related training programs or pathways being run locally, anticipated timeline of training cohorts, and relevant employers in your region hiring for priority occupations. Next, schools could conduct interviews and or focus groups with in-demand employers to discuss skills and profiles needed to inform ideal curriculum, typical hiring timeline, volume, and process to inform program design, and willingness to be involved in marketing and recruiting. Schools will also use this time to determine key C74 program internal capacity and approach, such as existing instructor availability, hiring of adjunct instructors from industry as necessary, adjusting curriculum to serve adult populations and 200 to 300 hour training requirements, cohort timelines, fiscal capacity, and marketing and recruiting strategy. Schools will also draft a program budget, including a need for startup funds. And lastly, schools will want to finalize partnership with MassHire and employer partners by clearly outlining the activities, responsibilities, and commitments of each partner, and receive MOUs or email commitments. As outlined in the grant, this opportunity makes available up to $200,000 at $10,000 per school. No matching funds are required, and we expect the contract duration or planning period to run from mid-February until the end of April. For the planning grant, the lead applicant is the same. However, there are only two required partners for application, the MassHire Career Center and MassHire Workforce Board. Planning grants are on a cost reimbursement basis. Short progress reports are required at monthly interviews to keep the ComCore team notified of key activities and any assistance needed. A final report will be required. If the grantee applies for the implementation grant due at the end of April as intended, the final report will be waived. All costs associated with the planning activities described in your submission are allowable. Throughout the planning period, there are several resources available to schools. First, schools will be assigned a ComCore program manager to support them. There are additional resources provided, such as a schedule worksheet, supporting documents for reporting enrollment and outcomes, a catalog of current programs and their focus, an example budget, and grantee meetings. Schools should also connect with Market Maker and Upskilling Navigator staff to support planning for recruitment and employer engagement. As outlined in the RFR, there are three main scoring criteria for the planning grant. The first is a track record of success and qualification or capacity for grant management, fiscal coordination, and implementation. The second is a demonstration of how this grant will help the grantee develop an implementation application in the spring of 2022. And lastly, we will evaluate the accuracy and consistency of the budget provided. For the planning grant, we have outlined a few key dates. As you know, the RFR was released on November 15th. We strongly suggest applicants submit written questions by November 29th. Proposals are due by December 15th at 5 p.m. We anticipate notification by mid-January and contracts to start by mid-February. Contract ends are expected to coincide with the submission of an implementation grant proposal at the end of April 2022. Lastly, I want to provide some quick guidance on the grant application and submission. There are 5 parts to the application package: the summary form, narrative form, budget form, the letters of commitment from MassHire partners, and certification. In addition, there are a few key tips for grant submission. The submission must be done once aligned with the information provided in the application summary. You must complete your submission in one session. Application information is included in the written RFR for you to review and draft prior to entering the grant submission form online. You are encouraged to review in advance and submit questions. Which brings me to our closing and opportunities to convene and ask questions, a summary of key dates mentioned in the presentation. To reiterate, there are 2 grants being released this November. The planning grant was released November 15th and is due by 5 p.m. on December 15th. The implementation grant will be released on November 30th and will be due by 5 p.m. on January 14th. Please feel free to contact us for further questions. Lastly, there are upcoming opportunities for schools and partners to attend live convenings and ask questions of the CTI team. First, schools who have previously received CTI funds through an initial round of funding or planning grant are invited to attend a convening on November 18th. For other CTI stakeholders, including schools who have not yet engaged, we have time on November 30th to provide a more in-depth overview of the program, discuss best practices, and allow for questions. To be added to either of these invites, please contact Jess at the email below or follow the link listed in the planning grant RFR. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to this webinar. Please do not hesitate to reach out with questions. We look forward to working with you through the grant process and beyond.